Hi everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the live podcast, which is all about growing food at home to live a bit more of a sustainable lifestyle. And today's episode is all about raised garden beds, and I'm going to share my top 10 tips for raised garden beds. I love growing in raised garden beds because it's a really quick way to start growing a lot of food, no matter what your soil is like, whether you have really sandy soil, really clay, hard, compact clay soil. Popping in some raised garden beds and putting all this good soil in is going to be a really quick way to start getting food. So in today's episode, we're going to do my highlight of the week, what's been happening in the garden, the plant of the week, and then we're just going to jump straight into the 10 tips for raised garden beds. If you've got any questions, make sure you pop them in the live chat, and I'll answer those at the end of the episode or throughout if I see them pop up and they are on the same questions that we're talking about. But highlights of the week. And feel free to let me know what yours are too. I would love to know. Okay. Highlights of the week. I always forget to actually prepare and think about this. But one, definitely feijoas. They're falling off the tree now. Every day, maybe twice a day, I'm picking feijoas from the ground. They're a lot of them get blown off in the night from the wind, so they're not necessarily fully ripe, but they're still ripe enough. They're still delicious, and I'm enjoying having those every morning. But I am collecting some, so I've got, I don't know which side it is, a little bit of a collection behind me that I'm going to do some recipes on the weekend with. So I'm excited for that. And also behind me is something new that I acquired this week, and that is a vanilla bean orchid. So I've seen this pop up on a few videos, especially food forest style gardens in Costa Rica. They have vanilla bean orchids growing all through the trees, and they look beautiful, and obviously they produce vanilla bean pods, which is super exciting. So I thought when I saw it, I need to try this out. So I've got it in a pot. I'm going to keep it inside, especially now that we're cooling down, we're getting into winter. I'll keep it there, and then my aim is to find somewhere in the garden for it. So I'm not too sure where that will be. Potentially, I would love to be able to get a cutting or a second plant off it before I do that, just like as insurance. I like to do that with most plants that I get, is try and take a cutting or something, so I have a backup plan if the one that I plant out doesn't make it. I like to have multiples, so we'll see if I can get that going, but I will show you as well. It's really beautiful plant. It's got bright green leaves. They're really glossy and shiny, and it's a climber. So I think this is going to be beautiful no matter where it goes, even if it has to stay inside. But we will see. And some other things that I did get, I got some fruit from the markets. So I got a giant papaya, a choco, and a taro. So I'm going to be planting these. So I just got them to plant. I feel like it's much cheaper to buy things like this at the markets and then just plant them rather than actually getting plants. I mean, this is going to have hundreds of seeds in it, this papaya. So instead of buying one papaya plant, I'm going to be able to germinate a whole bunch from this, and I get to eat the fruit as well. So I do have some growing in the garden, but I wanted to get a few more. And yeah, other than that, my gardens are looking really lush at the moment. Lots of things are starting to pop up and grow. So things that I planted a month ago are really starting to take shape now and looking really lush and green, as things tend to do in autumn and winter after such a hectic summer. So that is actually just inspiring me more. I'm very inspired at the moment to be in the garden, to be planting more things. And that's just because of momentum and seeing things happen. So if you aren't feeling like that, if you are feeling stuck or you feel like you've been left behind, you haven't planted enough yet for winter, or you're just not feeling inspired by the garden, then just throw some seeds in, throw some plants in. In a month's time, they'll pop up and you'll get excited and you'll get a renewed sense of inspiration and feel more motivated to get stuck in. So just start, pop some things in, even some herbs, and I'm sure that inspiration will find you once they start popping up. So that's pretty much what's been happening in the garden lately. I'm constantly planting at the moment still. I don't know how I still have any room, but I'm planting anyway, and just keep planting more and more and more. Autumn is like that for me. I do a lot of planting in autumn, especially staggered in stages for some succession planting, and also just filling in all those gaps, as many gaps as I can fill. And obviously I'm losing things to bugs and critters, so I can replace those ones with the new seeds. The slaters, are relentless in my garden. And a new one that I've got is these tiny, tiny, tiny snails. They look like snails that you would find in a fish tank, like the ones that clean the fish tanks, those little tiny, tiny snails. I have a whole bunch of those. So I've got a few things that I'm going to test out and see what I can do with that. So I'll definitely keep you in the loop and let you know how that goes. Because, that's something that is new and definitely eating my plants. But that's okay. I can share some things and I will just keep planting other things. But let's jump into the plant of the week. I've given you a little bit of a sneak peek on what that is going to be. And that is the papaya. So I have a papaya, I have a couple of papayas growing in the ground. I've got one in a pallet planter as well, which I'm trying out because I do get a lot of wind. So I'm trying to put them in places that are a lot more sheltered. Papayas are amazing, and I'm really excited to plant a whole lot more plants, and that's why I got this one here, so I can get all the seeds from this and I can plant heaps more rather than, buying one or two plants here and there. Papayas germinate really easily from seed, so why not plant a whole lot? The great thing about papayas is that you can eat them ripe or unripe. So they have multiple uses and you can get harvests throughout the growing period. You don't have to wait for them to be ripe. So, the ripe papaya is really sweet and juicy and delicious for breakfast. And the unripe papaya is sort of more used as a vegetable. You can grate that. It's delicious grated into salads. It absorbs so much flavor, like marinades and dressings and sauces. And then you can also use it cooked. So you can put it in curries and things like that. You can use it sort of similar to maybe a zucchini or a carrot. So it's so versatile in the garden, or in the kitchen. And you can make sweet or savory dishes then because you've got the sweet version and then obviously the raw or the unripe version. And they're also really, really delicious dehydrated. So you can make some really sweet, delicious, natural snacks or lollies from all the ripe papayas. Or you can ferment them, and you can ferment the unripe papayas as well. So there's so many different things you can do with them. I think they're a real powerhouse if you can grow papayas. They do like a warm climate, but that's not to say you can't try and make a little home for them. I know, like, my mum grows these in New Zealand, in Northland, in her greenhouse. So if you can have a greenhouse, then you may be able to grow these. But if you are in a warm climate, then these are definitely something to think about because they're going to provide you with so much food and so much variety in food. And one fruit is going to be able to reproduce so many seeds. So once you have one growing and you get a ripe fruit, you're pretty much set for life in the garden with papayas. And yeah, I just think they're delicious. And I'm going to be planting a whole lot more. So we'll see how that goes, and I'll definitely, let you know how they go and take you along for the germinating and all of that. But without further ado, let's get stuck into these 10 tips for raised garden beds. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed for all the upcoming episodes. But number one on the list of tips for raised garden beds is understand the sun and shade. So this is important, obviously, when you are deciding where to put your raised garden beds. But even once you have your raised garden beds established, the sun and shade is going to change. It's going to change over summer and winter. It's going to be different because in winter, the sun is a lot lower in the sky, so it casts a lot more shadows on things. So you'll find that you'll get a lot more shade in winter, and that's something to keep an eye on. And all your raised garden beds may be slightly different. So I have 4 raised garden beds, and the 4 raised garden beds don't all get the same amount of sun and shade. Some get more shade than others, some get more morning sun, some get more afternoon sun. So it's something to just to keep an eye on, make sure that you know. And that can be influenced by things around you. So in terms of the house or nearby trees. And this can change. So it's something that you're constantly looking at, because obviously if you have surrounding trees, they're going to get taller and provide more shade. Or like me, my neighbor cut down all the large trees, which, I just came home one day and all the trees were gone, which didn't affect the sun and shade too much on my raised veggie patch, but it did affect the wind because it was a really good wind buffer right on the fence line that was now gone. And it did provide a lot more light as well. So it's something that will change over time. So it's a good thing to just keep an eye on all the time. And knowing where the sun and shade is on your raised garden beds is going to determine what to plant where. So this can be really strategic. You can decide that in summer you want to plant some taller things on the side that gets the most sun to provide a bit of shade for the rest of the garden beds. And then in winter, you want to make sure that you're not planting the big things on the side that gets all the sun, because it's going to block out all the sun for the other plants, which is something that's much needed in winter. And then you can decide you can decide to plant all the shade-loving things in the shadier areas. So things like lettuces and leafy greens, if you're growing them during summer, they're going to want a bit more shade protection. So if you know which garden beds or which parts of the garden beds are getting the most shade, you can pop them there. And the same with the sun-loving things that want as much sun as possible. You can pop those in the areas or the raised garden beds that get the most sun. So it's just something to constantly be aware of. It's going to change. It's going to develop, and knowing where your sun and shade is going to really help you decide what to plant where, and you can be super strategic about it to either offer protection from sun or let sun in. And number 2 is have a compost system nearby. And that can be anything. It could be a compost bin, it could be a compost tumbler, it could be a worm farm, it could be an in-ground worm tower. It could be that you have a chop and drop area nearby, or a food forest style garden nearby where you like to just lay down all of the extra green material as mulch or chop and drop. But just knowing what system you have where and having something close by, something that's close and convenient, is going to make a really big difference. It means that you're going to be more likely to get out there, prune things, harvest things, take things off and pop them somewhere where they're going to be useful, rather than just putting it off or not doing it because you have to traipse it all out the back or the other side of your property to put it in the compost bin. And that also means that you're going to have compost or nutrition for your garden beds close by when the time comes to top the raised garden beds up, because that's important too, is to add nutrition into these garden beds. And if that's close by, it's so much easier than, traveling it from one end of your property to the other, because then you're probably less likely to do it, or you'll put it off and then it just won't happen. So having something close and convenient is just going to allow you to keep on top of your compost and your nutrition. And I like to do a lot of that in spring and autumn, because that's when I'm doing all of my planting, or the majority of my planting. So I will always be adding lots of compost to my raised garden beds in spring and autumn, and having that close by is really going to help. I didn't have one near my raised garden beds for a long time. I did have an area though that I was using for chop and drop. So anytime that I was had like leftover, cauliflower leaves or cabbage leaves or anything like that, I was laying down in the garden bed next to it, and using that to build layers of compost and soil in that garden bed. But I have recently popped a compost bin out the front, so now it's so much easier. I can just go out in the morning, take a look through the gardens, and if there's, things that I want to remove, leaves I want to remove, I just do that as I'm walking through the garden, pop it in the compost, and it's done. And it makes life so much easier. And number 3 is vertical structures. So have a think about what vertical structures you could have with your raised garden beds. And this can be great because if you need to add shade cloth, like I have to have shade on my raised garden beds because they're in the full sun in summer. And here in Perth, full sun is very extreme. We get weeks of over 40 degrees and just heats up the garden bed. It sucks all the moisture out and things can be crispy in a day if you don't water them. So for me, I have structures that I can put shade cloth on, but it could be for you if you're living in a colder climate that maybe you can put some frost protection over. So it's going to help keep your plants warmer, extend your season, and having some sort of structure is going to make it so much easier to do that. Whether that's a frame or a arch or something like that. Having some area of vertical growing, vertical structure is going to increase your growing area. So you're going to be able to grow a whole lot more, use up more space if you have some vertical structures for plants to grow up. So then you can grow, vines or peas, beans. My gosh, the bottle gourds in my garden this year were insane. Like I still have them behind me. I have so many more coming. So having, structures for things to climb up vertically is going to allow you to grow a whole lot more food in the same space. And this can also reduce diseases. So if plants are climbers or ramblers, having them just on the ground can mean that they're going to pick up a lot more diseases and pests. But being able to put them upright over a trellis or over an archway is going to help reduce the amount of pests and diseases. It's going to get them off the ground so they're not going to get splashed with soil and things like that as well. So it can be a really good way to reduce the pests and disease in your garden by having some vertical growing space. And there's so many different ways that you can do this. You could just have a tunnel going through the middle, or you could have some trellises on one side. And again, this is going to determine the sun and the shade. So make sure you know where the sun and shade is, so you know where you can put some vertical growing, and it's not going to shade out the rest of your garden, or it may shade out the rest of your garden on purpose because you want to offer more protection during the summer months or during the warmer months. Having something growing vertically could really, help out with shade. So it comes back to knowing about your shade and sun, to where to put your vertical growing structures or growing spaces. And number 4, my favorite, is edible flowers. So I like to put edible flowers in all my raised garden beds, and I tend to put them in the corners or on the sides because most edible flowers are quite small or low-lying. And having them on the sides means they're not going to be overshadowed or overcrowded by everything else growing in the middle. And they also act as little flags to the pollinators to say, come here, I've got some nectar, some pollen for you to pollinate, and that's going to then increase the size and amount of food you're going to produce from the garden, because pollination really is going to be the key to getting a successful harvest. Definitely with things like, your zucchinis, your melons, cucumbers, all of those, if you aren't getting correct pollination, you're not going to get as much food from it, or you're going to get smaller food from it. So bringing in as many pollinators as possible with edible flowers is definitely going to make a huge impact on your garden. And having a really wide range of different colors, different types of flowers, because that's going to bring in a wider range of beneficial insects and pollinators to the garden. And the more diversity in flowers, the more diversity in pollinators and wildlife, the more you're going to get things pollinated and the more food you're going to get out of it. And that also is going to bring in more natural pest management. So a lot of our beneficial insects are going to help out with the natural pest management. And I've got little birds that come and get the nectar from some of my flowers, but while they're there, they, feast on the little snails and things like that as well. So there are some birds that come and do both, and having those flowers helps bring them in. And edible flowers do have nutrients. They add little micronutrients, and I love using them in cooking and in meals because they just add color and vibrance, and it looks a lot more exciting. And same with the garden. It adds so much more color to the garden. It makes me feel joy when I walk through the garden. If I see all these flowers, it adds color as well. So there's so many reasons to have edible flowers in the garden, and that is why I have them in every single garden, especially in my raised garden beds. All right, so number 5. I'm doing pretty good with the numbering here. Normally, if you've been watching my YouTube channel for a while, you know that my YouTube videos, I always stuff up the numbering. I've actually gone to the point now where I just don't number things because I normally stuff it up, but so far so good on this. We've got number 5, which is soil. So you want to make sure the top 30 centimeters of soil in your raised garden beds is the good stuff. So the bottom half of the raised garden bed, if you want to, make it more economical and fill it up with other things, then just make sure that the top 30 centimeters is the good stuff, is the real nutritious stuff, because that's basically where all the roots are going to be on most of your annual plants, are going to be within the first 30 centimeters. So if you are going to be filling up your raised garden beds with other things to, reduce the amount of good soil you're needing to put in there, then just make sure you layer it and mix it up. So you're not putting in big clumps of green material or big clumps of sticks and stuff. I like to mix it all up, do sort of lasagna layering style, and that's going to make it easier to break down. Then if you put in a big clump of green material, it might start to just rot and fester a little bit. Whereas if you spread it all out, mix it in with some small sticks. I also put, leaves, dried leaves, and my own terrible sandy soil in there as well, along with a bit of compost. I sort of mix it all in layers, but then I make sure that the top part of the raised garden bed soil is the good stuff. And then I just continue to add things on top. So I do a no-dig style in my raised garden beds. I continuously layer things on top, which we will get into in another number. So number 6 is plant diversely. So this is something that I do in all my gardens, especially in my raised garden beds, is I like to mix all my plants up. I don't plant a whole raised garden bed in one thing. I will pop lettuces, some lettuce in this one, some in the other one. Then I'll put some cauliflower in one and the other one, and I just do it all mixed in together. And that's what has worked really well for me. It means that I haven't got all my eggs in one basket. So if I put them all in one garden bed and then something happens, or bugs find it, or the soil was not right in that garden bed, then I don't lose the whole crop. I only lose what was in that garden bed. So I always like to mix things all diversely. And I think that also really helps with the soil health. It stops, you getting major nutrient deficiencies because, if you have a whole garden bed in one thing, they're basically going to be sucking up all the same nutrients. Whereas if you have things all intermixed and interplanted, then they're going to be taking different amounts of each nutrient, and you're less likely to get these severe depletions of certain nutrients. Same with diseases and things like that. If you're growing all tomatoes in one garden bed and then you get diseases, that can be they can stay in the soil and affect other things. Whereas if you have things spread out, you're less likely to get those really heavy disease soils. And having this diversity of plants is then going to bring in the diversity of insects and wildlife and microorganisms. And all of that is going to mean that you're going to get an overall healthy garden bed, because the more diversity you have, seems to be, for me, definitely the more healthier my gardens are. So that's what works for me. I love planting diversely. I love mixing everything in, especially all of my annuals, my edible flowers, and also the next one, which is number 7, is perennials. So I mix perennials in as well. I like to have a few perennials in all of my raised garden beds. And perennials are things that grow for more than a year. So things that grow either die down and grow back each season, or they just constantly grow all year round. And I feel like this gives you a lot more of a consistent food supply. You're never really having to start from zero. You always have something in that garden bed. And that can just be helpful in terms of motivation and just being like, not feeling so overwhelmed that you have to, start from scratch and plant the whole garden bed out again. If you've got little things left in from other seasons or things that grow all year round, it's not going to be so overwhelming, and you're going to be excited to, have some gaps to plant in, rather than being like, oh my gosh, I have so much area to plant. And having these things that are growing longer term is going to offer more protection, because they will already be established. They may be taller. They may be able to offer some protection from the sun. They may be able to, provide a little area of shade that you can pop the little seedlings in underneath, or they may protect from the frost. And then having these perennials in your garden bed and not having to start from scratch and not having to completely redo the garden bed each time is going to save you time and effort. So you're going to get more food without having to do as much work, which I love. I love harvesting all my food and cooking it and things like that. But I still love planting things, but having things in the garden already is definitely exciting. And number 8 is have a water source nearby. And this is also kind of similar, I guess, to having the compost system nearby or somewhere to compost nearby. It's make it close and convenient. If it's not close and convenient, often it can get forgotten about or just put off. And here in Perth in summer, you cannot put off watering on those really hot days, or things will just die or overheat. So by having it close and convenient is really going to make a big difference, especially in summer. Because just like this morning, I went out into the garden. I like to walk around my gardens in the morning with a coffee, and I was walking around and I noticed that the raised garden beds were quite dry. And it's always important to just check under the soil, because it could just be that the top part is dry and the underneath is completely moist, and you don't want to be overwatering it either. So always just have a check in the soil. It also could look moist, but when you dig underneath, it's dry. So I did that this morning and I noticed it needed water, and I could just quickly get my hose. I have a hose right next to my raised garden beds. It's retractable, so I don't have to fight it. I don't have to try and unkink it. I just pull it out, turn it on, water the gardens, and done. So easy, so quick. And it meant that I didn't have to, go inside, put my coffee down, undo the hose, or get a watering can and take it out the front. It was just done. So I think that's really important for when you're planning out your raised garden beds, is to have water source nearby. And then number 9 is we want to add nutrients in. So our raised garden beds have a limited amount of nutrition. And by planting all these things in it each season, it's going to use up some of that nutrition. So it's important that we constantly think about putting nutrients back into our raised garden beds. And there's heaps of different ways to do that. Some of the ways that I do for adding nutrients back into my garden is I have a layer of mulch. So I use a pea straw mulch a lot of the time. That adds a little bit of nutrition as it breaks down. And then at spring and autumn, I top that up again with new mulch. And I just pop that on top. So what I normally do is I have the mulch, and usually it's half blown away or broken down over summer. And then I add fresh compost on top, just on top of the mulch. And then I will add another layer of mulch on top of that. So over time, you're getting layers of mulch, compost, and it's going to keep adding nutrition to the garden beds, because the soil will go down over time if you're not adding stuff in. Even if you didn't put sticks and leaf matter at the bottom when you were starting them, even if you just had soil, it's still going to go down over time. So constantly topping it up is going to really help with that. And other ways that you can do it is liquid fertilizers. So if your garden beds are already full and you don't have room to add compost, or you don't have any compost, or you don't have enough, then you can make some liquid fertilizers. And there's a whole bunch of different liquid fertilizers that you can make. You can make them from compost by soaking your compost in water and using a liquid version of it. You can, ferment some weeds or some greens, or chop and drop all the greens from your garden, and you can pop them in a bucket, let them start to rot down and infuse all of their goodness into the water, strain them off, and then use that liquid in the garden. And the same with worm tea. So if you do have a worm farm, or someone has one, then you can get the worm liquid and water it down, and then use that to feed your gardens. And that's going to add so much goodness in. And it's easier to do that when you have things already planted, because that way, you can just pour the liquid all around them, and you're not having to try and carefully put compost on top of little seedlings and things like that. So if you already have the gardens pretty much established, then that's when I'd be adding in the liquid fertilizers. But if you are kind of starting from scratch, or you have quite an empty garden bed, that's the good time to chuck all the compost in and remulch it. And you can also have worm towers. So you can do DIY on these as well. I've got DIY ones. Basically, all you want to do is have some sort of structure where you can pop it into the soil, have holes in the side of it so the worms can go in and out, and then you fill the tower with scraps. So anytime you're wanting to remove leaves, or something's overgrowing and you want to pull those leaves off to let light in, you can pop it in the compost tower or the worm tower. Make sure you've got a lid on it, because you don't want rats and mice getting in, or birds or anything like that. So always have a lid on it. Open it up, pop all the stuff in there, put it down, and then all I do is, after a while, if it's getting full, I'll stop putting stuff in there, let it break down for a couple of weeks, and then just pull it up and move it to another place. Leave whatever was there. So all the good soil that we've just made, all the worms and stuff, we just leave there and we just move it to another place. And having good soil and having, all these tips that we've talked about so far, if you do this, worms will come. You don't need to put worms in your garden bed. They will come. If you build a really healthy, vibrant, diverse garden bed, the worms will come. And they'll come quickly. It's insane to see how much worms appear, and you wonder where they've come from. I find them in pots on concrete, so far from the soil. I've had so many worms pop up. And I'm just like, how did you get here? Did you just crawl all the way along the concrete? They must do. But if you build it, they will come. So don't worry about that. Just focus on, adding all these nutrients, adding diversity. So the last one, which is something that is a little bit unusual. I don't know I know not everyone does this, but it's something that I've been doing and I've been finding it really successful. And that is number 10, to leave the roots in the ground. So when I'm harvesting things at the end of the season, so for example, I did it at the end of my winter season, instead of pulling out all my cauliflowers and my broccolis, I just cut them at the base and I left the whole root system in the ground. And then all the tops and leaves and stuff I popped in the compost, but I left all the roots in the ground. And the same with my pumpkins, anything like that, like basically all the plants. I just cut them at the base and left all the roots in the ground. So now, since winter, those roots have been breaking down in the soil. They've been adding nutrients slowly into the soil as they compost. And then by the time I'm now here planting, they've broken down. So this isn't going to work with everything in terms of huge trees and things like that. Those roots probably won't break down quick enough for you to use the space. But small things, small annuals, their roots aren't huge, so they're going to break down really quickly. One thing that is important though is if the plant has died unexpectedly, there's no reason for it to die, it just got sick and died, then I would definitely pull that out. One, you want to be able to take a look and see if you can find out why it died. And often the roots are a really good indicator on why it died. So if you pull the roots out of the dead plant, you may see that, some things eaten all the roots away, or there's fungus on the roots, or there's big knobbly nematode things on them. There's so many things you can find out from the roots. And also, if it did die of disease, you don't really want that just sitting in the garden bed. So if it has got sick and died, then I would definitely pull that out and not be breaking that down in the garden. But other than that, it also just saves so much time. You don't have to wrestle with it, and then, because sometimes when you pull things out, their roots have gone quite far and they're all intertwined with other plants. So if you pull it out, you're often pulling up other healthy plants that you weren't intending on pulling up, and can make it quite difficult and quite annoying. So that's going to save that if you do just cut it at the base, leave it in the ground to break down naturally. And I mean, that is what's happening in nature anyway, isn't it? Things are breaking down naturally like that. Nature's not pulling it up and putting it somewhere else. So I like to try and think of things in the way that, what does nature do? Nature knows a lot more than me and is a lot better at it than me. So where I can try and replicate nature or work with nature, that's what I try and do. So that's something to consider. If you have things that are coming to end of life, just cut them off at the base, leave the roots in the soil, and let it naturally break down in the soil. That is the top 10 tips. So I hope that has helped you. I'm going to answer some questions now because we've got a little bit of time. So if you do have any questions, pop them in the live chat. And let's catch up on what's been happening in your gardens, because I love how diverse our watchers are from all parts of the world, and you offer some really good advice. You offer so much in the live chat, so I really want to say thank you for that. And we've got, all these different countries. It's so awesome. And people are also in different times. So some people are coming into spring now, some people are coming into autumn, or are in autumn like me. So it's so interesting to see. What has been happening in your gardens? Oh no. So we've got lots of cabbage moth plant died. Papaya plant died because it got knocked over. Yeah, papaya plants do get knocked over in the wind very easily. So I've had that trouble in my garden. So I'm trying to pop them in really sheltered areas. We get so much wind here, especially in summer. The wind is insane. Sometimes it keeps me up at night because I'm thinking about my plants. And I can't sleep when I can hear that wind because I'm like, it's just knocking all my feijoas hours off or something like that. What else have we got? Lots of edible flowers. Compost and green manure mulch is all my garden gets. That's great. As long, using what you have in your garden is the ultimate way. Like using leftover green matter from your garden to then feed the soil is amazing. Yay, I leave the roots in the soil. Lots of people leaving their roots in the soil. That's so good to see. In cold climate, we just wait until spring to clean up. The roots have deteriorated by then. That's awesome to hear as well. Yeah, we are pretty lucky here in Perth. My camera's unfocusing. That we can grow all year round. But many gardeners do have to let their gardens go dormant over winter when it is too cold. So having those things in the ground breaking down is just slowly adding nutrition. So by the time you come to spring and you can plant again, then you can, have more nutrition in your soil. But those are the tips for today. My camera is definitely losing light here. We are getting so much darker now, we're definitely losing light a lot earlier. But thank you all for joining me. I hope you got some inspiration from those 10 tips for raised garden beds. And I will see you guys here at the same time next week for another episode. I hope you have an amazing week and get some time out in the garden. See ya.